Welcome to another episode of the Hate Meditations podcast. I would like to kick off by addressing a grievous error I made in the last episode. I indicated that I might be interested in some of your feedback and thoughts on things, and what I actually meant to say is I have no interest in anything any of you have to say. But today we are talking about Ildjarn, and I can't think of two people that I'd rather be discussing this topic with. We have back on the front lines of the Hate Meditations podcast at the coalface, the one and only Tyler. Thank you very much, Tyler, for joining us.
Thank you for having me again. Looking very much forward to talking about Ildjarn today.
And I am pleased to introduce Mike. Are you happy in being referred to as Mike, or do you have like a stage name you want to be called, like Necro Butcher, Anal Sodomizer, or?
Oh, n- I think you should make me one up. That was pretty good, for off the cuff. Yeah, but
And we
Mike
have
is fine. Yeah.
Mike
We'll go with
von
Mike.
Necro Butcher Anal Sodomizer, who is joining us for the first time in his Hate Meditations debut. Who is a long-time gig buddy of mine, and we have discussed Ildjarn off the cuff after many, many beers quite a few times. So I'm very happy to have him on for this discussion as well. So good to have you on, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, no, happy to be here and to be discussing metal relatively sober. Let's see if it works out quite as well.
I have
Who
a
knows?
question.
We'll see. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I am already.
What other kind of sodomizer is there than an anal sodomizer?
I don't know, man. I was just ramping.
Maybe an aural, Aural. I feel like maybe that's an apt description for the person we're about to spend the next hour talking about.
Well,
That's a really good point.
Ildjarn would not approve because I believe he was completely straight edge, but I'm already 3 beers deep. But anyone that subjects themselves to like what counts for promo blurbs accompanying new extreme metal releases in 2025 will have accounted the word abusive in that it's often taken as a compliment. But when I say that this artist, aka Ildjarn, is abusive, I mean that pretty much literally. In sort of detaching it from the hyperbole that accompanies sort of social media age metal, listening to Ildjarn is just straight up torture, or at the very least, it's kind of like a vigorous workout. The repetition, the physicality, the diminished mental state that you have to cultivate in order to endure just a single album of his work. But equally similar to a workout, the feeling of like achievement that you have coming out the other side, the sort of cleansing or the sense of purpose that you get. It's almost like a heightened state of awareness that comes from like switching off the intellect and focusing on just one repetitive, rudimentary task. And Ildjarn, he's not abusive in the visceral sense that you might call like war metal, like a blasphemy or a conqueror or so on. Nor is he extreme in the way that modern extreme metal is, where it reaches for degrees of greater speed or this very cosmic production, or they're forever chasing this nebulous idea of what heaviness is. Ildjarn is very kind of modest by comparison when you're just the immediate experience of it, I would say. And perhaps he is one of the purest attempts to maybe integrate the underlying ethos of punk into black metal. His music is, I mean, appropriately like a meditation. It's a monotonous, monomaniacal, obsessive, almost psychotic rumination on a single idea. And his discography is kind of very divisive because of that, and it's often overlooked in the canon of like Norwegian second wave as a result. And it's often only redeemed in the eyes of many by the forgiving hand of his longtime collaborator Nidhogg, who in many ways kind of tempered Ildjarn's rougher edges, resulting in maybe some of his finest work. But like the kind of output of Ildjarn is kind of almost confusing and as surprising in equal measure as a result, boasting some of the most ugly but also the most beautiful moments you're likely to find in Norwegian black metal, alongside more typical but no less captivating work in the anomalous sort of Vodka folkloric necro metal album, which we'll also be discussing. His music could be described as the founding document of what is now referred to as raw black metal or lo-fi black metal, or were it not for the physicality and improvised nature of his surprisingly extensive back catalogue, ambient black metal, sometimes less charitably referred to as bedroom black metal. Regardless of this contested legacy, he remains, despite the fanatical simplicity of his music, an artist I return to more regularly than I do most artists, perhaps the exceptions being a Burzum or an Immolation. He dismantles my picture of what music itself should be in my mentality, forcing me to rebuild and relearn exactly what music is, let alone black metal itself and what it's even capable of as an art form. But I know that many of you are listening to that are basically wanting to piss in my eyeball and say he is a talentless hack with no ability, was a misanthrope, even by the standards of Norwegian black metal, and his legacy should be long forgotten. But we're not going to do what we normally do for a focus episode here because his discography is a little bit all over the place, even if you discount his collaborator Nidhogg, in that his key albums are all released in the space of about 2 years. But he did start out in Thou Shalt Suffer with the boys from Emperor, and I guess that in itself is surprising given where Ildjarn landed and where obviously Emperor ended up. They are basically between the two nodes of this band, they almost border the outer limits of what Norwegian black metal was able to express, with Ildjarn being the absolute outer limits of the most primitive example, and Emperor being the grandiose symphonic orchestral limits of the genre as it was in the mid 90s. So I guess rather than starting with a particular album, I'll just invite your opening comments, and then we might dig into the core 3 black metal albums that one tends to discuss with Ildjarn, that being self-titled Strength and Anger and Forest Poetry. So Tyler, I'll start with you. What's your relationship to Ildjarn? Was everything I said just bullshit just now, or do you have a different take, a different slant on why you wanted to talk about this artist for the next hour or so?
I don't necessarily have a different take on it. Ildjarn is also one of the artists that I come back to and visit more often than many other artists. He's one of my most frequent listens. And I think that it's astounding to me how something of such seeming simplicity can hold such repeat listen value for, most commonly in my experience, listeners of a more discerning taste. There's going to be a lot of people who laugh at me for that one, but you know what? You all can fuck off. Anyhow, most of the people that I know who are ardent fans of Ildjarn are the kind of people who have a more intellectual take on extreme metal, and yet, despite this, Ildjarn remains a perennial favorite amongst that cast of metal listeners, in seeming defiance of the fact that his music is so incredibly simple. But I think that's one of the endearing qualities of his music, is that there is more going on than a surface level complexity. There is a very naturalistic, in the sense that it is almost improvisational, confluence of parts. In fact, in a certain way, this is going to sound very pompous, I would say that Ildjarn's music almost represents a very close approximation of a kind of chain of cause and effect that you could witness in an ecosystem. And I think that in some senses, the man himself would be irritated at my comparison, but would also restate it in his own, perhaps much more vulgar terms in essentially the same way.
Yeah, I think that's one of the interesting things about this crop of Norwegian bands is, much as I wax lyrical about them, I am aware that they, as people, would thoroughly hate me and everything I have to say about their music, but that, in a sense, almost makes me love it more in a weird way. But yeah, Mike, what's your take?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you used the phrase talentless hack in your little introduction. And I've seen that accusation leveled at Ildjarn in reading a couple of reviews just before we jumped on of his albums. And I think that can be demonstrated to be kind of untrue in that, he was in Thou Shalt Suffer, and the bass parts are quite prominent on their relatively small oeuvre, and we can hear that the guy can play a little bit, right? He's not a terrible musician. And there's a lot of aesthetic choices going on throughout his discography. You've mentioned Vodka, the collaborations with Nidhogg, the ambient work, the metal, which kind of evolves throughout the demos to get progressively harsher. he's making aesthetic decisions, right? He's not crap at his instruments. He's deliberately underplaying. That's to me that's interesting, and that's part of what I find. Yeah, maybe first got me interested in this artist because where I came at it was hearing the self-titled sort of eponymous album back to back with landscapes, probably accidentally through YouTube's algorithm. This is quite a few years ago. And I was instantly just like, how can this be the same artist? Like, what's going on here? It seemed like a paradox where you've got this sort of 2 hour long, ultra still ambient album that's very meditative, doesn't evolve much. It just kind of gives you this sense of almost alien calm. And then the kind of raw ferocity, primal energy of the metalworks, which moves about and shifts quite rapidly. So there's clearly a lot going on. There's like Tyler mentioned, there's more to this than meets the eye. It's about making a little go a long way. It's about stripping away absolutely everything that could be considered extraneous or a nicety and giving it as it is, pure, primal, raw. That's what I like about Ildjarn. I guess that's also what people hate about Ildjarn. So those are my opening thoughts.
Yeah, I guess it's that sense of what I was clumsily reaching for in the intro is like it resetting my idea of what not to be too grandiose about it, but what music can or should be. And I guess that's the sort of purpose of minimalism, which essentially what the tradition that Ildjarn either unknowingly is sort of excuse me, tapping into here is this sense of like stripping all of your ideas about music back to its barest rudiments and then using that as a platform to rebuild on. And, there are artists that you can compare it to in that regard in terms of like a Bahira or something, where it becomes so basic and Prophet Attica as well being a good example, where it becomes so basic and kind of primal. And as Tyler said, like you just get this sense of cause and effect in a very, very visceral sense, which makes it so much more compelling than the, you know, something like a Gorguts or the most technical, dense kind of death metal or whatever. And I think that is kind of the bridge between the ambient and the metal is concerned. Is it's more of a conceptual link, a stylistic link, obviously. But I suppose as we kind of dance around it, we'll just quickly dive in. Well, not quickly, but we'll dive into the self-titled debut released in 1995, as most of his works were, which I think in many ways is like the purest statement of the Ildjarn that I'm talking about here, because I think forest poetry being like maybe the iconic and most known work to some extent, and Strength and Anger being the kind of the edgelord choice, for want of a better word, not just because of the title, but just because because of its delivery, its posture, everything about it. But the Ildjarn debut is like it's very modest in its presentation. It's not an overly aggressive album. It's very kind of droning, and it does function more like an ambient work, sort of proto-ambient black metal in a lot of ways. And you get these really primal like hardcore punk numbers, but they're kind of delivered on this very sort of washed out, diminished production. And every now and then, in sort of it's quite a lengthy runtime. It's over an hour long, but every now and then you'll get these fragments of melody. He'll deliver like a clean vocal line, which is sort of like a religious chant or something, or he'll deliver this little harmony or melody over just sort of to ornament or decorate the just relentless atonality and power chord like barrage at just mid-paced punky kind of numbers. And it just at that moment is kind of just a moment of relief where it's like, that's what music, that's like a hint of real music in the middle of it. But I find that so much more like such a more intense experience than the more extreme aggression that you get on something like forest poetry, for example.
Yeah, no, it's a great album. I know I would maybe just point first to its drum sound as having both. I mean, it's the worst drum sound I think in recorded music. Let's get it straight. But that doesn't detract for me from the experience of the album.
Whoa!
It's really
Saint Anger
part of it.
exists.
That's true. I guess, yeah. You could get a crap drum sound for a lot cheaper than what they were spending, is I guess what Ildjarn was pointing out with this. But yeah, I mean, it's probably. I think you're right to point out that it maybe lacks the kind of ferocity and the kind of assault of forest poetry. It's in a weird way, even though it's heavy, it's extreme music. It's kind of like it's not as in your face and aggressive sounding because of the way it's produced. I don't know how deliberate that was. You can hear through the demos he was putting out in the preceding 2 or 3 years, like a slight evolution in sound, not a big one. I mean, Ildjarn's sound doesn't really evolve. That's sort of something he quite proudly talks about in one of his interviews, that his ideas that he was putting out in 91, he's basically expressing the same thing by the end of his career in the late 90s. So yeah, no, but I think it's a cool album. Is it the most successful in his discography? I would say no, but it's probably a good starting point just to get that sense of the monotonous yet hypnotic kind of barrage of very short songs where you get these little phrases of power chords that are really 2 or 3 chords to a phrase. They move up. You might go up a tone and then down a semitone, or that's basically the pattern, and it repeats and then it finishes. And there's these kind of extremely harsh vocals over the top. So, yeah. Tyler, any thoughts?
I think that with Ildjarn, I've said this many times before, and to some it may even seem like an excuse. The secret to really tapping into his music is that you have to listen to an entire album. It's definitely not something that you can pick individual songs from. To some extent, I can't name individual songs by Ildjarn at all. Um, I can somewhat remember them as I'm listening to the album, but in general, if you ask me to name a song by Ildjarn or to name a favorite song by Ildjarn, I'm not going to be able to tell you. Unless you're talking about the Ambient albums, that's a little bit of an exception. But talking about the debut album, for instance, when you were speaking, Mike, about the 2 or 3 power chords per song, moving in very broad, slight shifts. I think that's exactly why listening to the entire album with Ildjarn is so important, because he, in a manner similar to Burzum, and you could say in kind of the tradition that was also followed, extending all the way back to Hellhammer and moving on forward through groups like Darkthrone, Ildjarn kind strips away almost all other facets of music to where all you have is the pure emotion imparted from the shift in tone throughout the piece. It's almost as if it is purely a stream of melody and nothing else, which I think takes a certain level of genius to be able to do well, despite Ildjarn's repeated insistence on portraying himself as a kind of idiot savant, I suppose you could say.
Yes. Nonetheless, I think he would. I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but I think from reading the interviews that he did, not that there are many, there's this sense that he is. The sum is, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's the idea with this. Like, I don't think we'd be talking about this artist if we didn't get some kind of. There should be a better word than profound, but I'm going to have to say profound feeling or experience from listening to this music, in that even though it's simplistic and repetitive, that doesn't really matter, because what you're experiencing over the course of a 60-minute listening session to one of his albums is something far more kind of is bigger than that. It takes you somewhere. It takes you to a place, and it takes you on a journey. I think reading some of the negative reviews, I think people are maybe a bit too fixated on the fact that there's just not much going on here musically when you break it down and analyze, the guitar playing. It's irrelevant. And if you're listening to like, power metal, yeah, sure, maybe you analyze the guitar playing because you care about that sort of thing. This is not that kind of music, So just some reaction to that.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said I can't name a single Ildjarn song. In the ones that I can name are all called Strength for Anger, and the rest of them are in Norwegian. And I should have said at the top of this episode, be ready for me to butcher some Norwegian because I can't speak the language. And despite my
I
long
thought
time,
forest poetry has English titles.
oh, it
Doesn't
does. Yeah, no, it does. Like, yeah,
I think it does. Yeah.
there's the title track. There's Cold and Waste. There's a few others that but it's not like Towards the Pantheon or Battles in the North or fucking Transylvanian Hunger or My Journey to the Stars. There's not like these standout big symphonic moments where I'm just like, yes. Particularly with the debut, it is just this constant drone. And as I kind of said when I introduced this album, is like those moments where there is a hint of something, like a granular moment where it's like, oh, there's a harmony, there's a melody, there's something consonant. It only makes sense in that context. It's only that little reward that he gives you within this long, torturous, droning material. If you were to splice that out and put it in a playlist or whatever, yes, it would be cool, but it wouldn't be anywhere near as profound. It does need to be treated as this whole hour-long piece in a lot of ways. And also, in a sense, I keep referring to the time as well, but it's not... Okay, we are going to sound pretentious in this episode. Just give us some slack. Time almost makes no sense when you lose track of time in an Ildjarn album because there are no landmarks, there are no like peaks and troughs, there's no contours, there's no topography. It's just a constant thing, and then there's this little rise and then this little fall. And I think that's what makes these moments stand out. And as you were both sort of saying, and that's why we think that Ildjarn is probably a far more intelligent composer than he tends to let on in that sense, because the placement is almost too perfect in a way, and it's something that Burzum hints at, but Burzum he's kind of almost too traditional in that sense, that he's still focused on events in the traditional sense of black metal, in that there are clear events and moments and narratives in the Burzum material that kind of make it flow, and he does it very, very profoundly. But Ildjarn sort of says no to all of that and just says, here's like a hint, here's like a little token gesture to what you expect from music, and the rest of it's just going to be just this slew of
I mean, there is, I guess, in those longer compositions by Burzum and other artists, there's a sense of like this kind of narrative development, like stuff happens, there are different musical ideas and phrases, and it evolves, and the phrases talk to each other, and it culminates in something, and there's usually melody to some extent. I think maybe like deliberately, Ildjarn cuts everything he does up into sort of 90-second, 2-minute chunks. So there's none of that. You don't even find your stride before the song is over. So I think it forces you in a way to listen to it as a single piece. It's not like I'm going to stick on that 7-minute track that I fucking love, because that's all I've got time to listen to right now. That just would not work with this artist. You don't try and cherry pick individual tracks. It is more like setting aside time to listen to an ambient album front to back and almost forget everything else and stick the headphones on, go for a walk, whatever, and just kind of really sink into it. That's the only way you can really experience this music. If you stick it on in the background, it's probably just going to irritate you and everybody else you're in the room with.
If you're in the room,
I've never tried listening to it with other people. Like, how would normal people react? I don't even know. I dread to think.
I think I tried to do it once or twice as a student when I was like trolling people with black metal, but I would not subject people to this in a room. I haven't listened to it in the car or on headphones, but
yeah.
So, Tyler, how would you explain an album like Forest Poetry to a fan of maybe black metal that has only heard, I don't know, Dark Funeral and maybe the bigger Immortal albums?
That's an interesting question. I think that Forest Poetry is hilariously titled. When you tell someone you're going to show them a black metal album titled Forest Poetry, and they're not familiar with Ildjarn, but they are familiar with black metal, they are not getting what they're expecting. Um, they they are looking forward to something melodic and lush and quote unquote beautiful. Not that Ildjarn isn't beautiful in its own way, but that's not what happens. In fact, talking about playing Ildjarn for people who haven't heard him before, my friends who are all rabid Ildjarn fans now, I largely introduced them to black metal in our teenage years, and when I first showed them Ildjarn, their initial reaction was laughter. um, they laughed until they cried. um, my friend Cody remarked on how all he could hear was some guy shrieking black metal vocals and very loud drums doing a constant beat. Um, but yeah, anyhow, how would I explain forest poetry to someone who is used to dark funeral? That would I'm not sure what I would tell them. I think that if they were only used to something like Dark Funeral, the only thing I could do was tell them that Ildjarn is far more raw and simplistic. And I don't know in this context if that person is familiar with raw black metal. Um, but if they are, that's about the only comparison I could draw that perhaps would make some sense to them. I think that maybe I could try to talk up Ildjarn by mentioning how it is a matter of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts, that you have to give it repeated listens and really allow the album to build up over you as an experience of sorts. But I also don't know if someone who's a regular listener of music like Dark Funeral would be willing to do that or not.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I raise that question because I'm like, okay, not just a fan of music, but like someone that's already thinks of themselves as an extreme metal fan, but likes the bigger budget stuff, but maybe hasn't delved as deep as something like Ildjarn. And we're saying this like, oh, it's so extreme or whatever, but like I tried to say in the intro, it's not that extreme in terms of if you're familiar with like fucking Blasphemy, who are, you know, a pretty big band these days. Uh, Ildjarn is not more extreme than that. It's not faster. It's not. I wouldn't even say it's heavier, even though I'm not quite sure what that word means. But like, it's just more tedious. It's just harder
Right,
to
because
get
that's the
through.
funny thing.
And
Like
forest
if
poetry,
like Blasphemy and other groups of that nature, sometimes I feel that you have more luck introducing someone, at least as a fan of at least someone who's a fan of extreme metal, to something like Blasphemy than you would something like Ildjarn. You get less uh you get less how do I want to put it? Less adverse reactions to Blasphemy than you would to something like Ildjarn. And it, even though I think you're right, Shelley, that Ildjarn in many ways is less extreme than a group like Blasphemy or Revenge or Conqueror, in some ways people's reactions to it are almost as if Ildjarn is in some ways more extreme than those bands are, more difficult to listen to.
Hmm.
yeah, and forest
It
poetry.
doesn't throw the it doesn't throw the listener a bone at all. You know, even more similarly kind of raw and harsh black metal bands they'll have melodic lead playing occasionally. You know, they'll have more variety in tempo. They'll have just things going on that give the listener some kind of reprieve. And I just think that's totally absent in Ildjarn. There's no reprieve for the listener. There's no hint of accessibility whatsoever. That's probably one of the big differences.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm leading to with forest poetry is that I think even just listening to it, let alone, I mean, I'm looking at, I've got the Metal Archives page open. It's got the most reviews. It's again, it's just as divisive as any Ildjarn album is, but that indicates that it's probably his most well-known album. But also, you kind of reminded me early on that it has the English like track names, which kind of allows me to somehow navigate it. And yeah, you've got like the opener, which I would take as just like Whispering Breeze, which I would sort of treat as like a hardcore punk banger. I'd sort of listen to that on the same level as I would a Discharge track. And then you get like you kind of go through this sort of cacophony of noise and then you get to something like Cold and Waste, and then you get to the end, No Place Nowhere, and like there are these little ripples of like hints of something going on. I wouldn't call it anything like a melody or an anthem or even a hook to some extent, but most of it is just this very, very primitive, hardcore, oi punk derivation, but just interpreted through a black metal lens. And yeah, as you said, Micah, there is no let up in that. But forest poetry is the closest Ildjarn comes to writing like an anthem. Like Whispering Breeze is, I wouldn't call it an anthem, but if Ildjarn was to write an anthem, it's the closest he ever came to it. It's like probably his most accessible album, but it's also for a fan of modern behemoth, Dark Funeral, your bigger budget extreme metal. It is impenetrable in a way that stuff like maybe Impaled Nazarene or Blasphemy or Beherit is not, just because it is so relentless in its desire to be monotonous in a way.
Yeah. That's probably how I would describe it to someone who was coming to this kind of a little bit cold, and just say, almost don't think of it as a black metal album if that doesn't help you. Like, listen to it as an ambient album, and try and experience it as this kind of hypnotic, repetitive, dark, evocative experience. And if you're not really into listening to music in that way, like if you don't really like ambient music or music that requires the listener to fill in a lot of the blanks with their own imagination, you're probably not going to enjoy it. That just fundamentally, there's no hope for you. Any reaction to that? Like, what do you think? Is that right? Is that how you listen to it? Am I wrong?
No, it's paradoxical in a way, because I agree in that I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the listener is required to fill in the blanks. But like I'm thinking about the other end of the spectrum of my musical taste in terms of, well, and your taste as well, because you're a big fan of like prog rock as well, which is famous for over curating the listener with information. And it's weird that the taste of the metalhead can go from one extreme to the other, in that if you take the densest, most off the top of my head, I mentioned Gorguts earlier, like Obscura as an album, like the most overly saturated album in terms of information. But then at the other end of my taste is this Ildjarn, thinking about these albums as well as like his ambient work, Landscapes, where it's the emptiest, most open-ended, ambiguous kind of music. It is odd that like, and I am typical, sorry, in this regard, in that I think a lot of metalheads, there's a reason why they tend to gravitate towards ambient and neo-folk and very, very minimal electronica when they're not listening to metal, because they really like minimalism, but it's sort of like a counterweight to their desire for incredibly dense and like overly stuffed musical statements at the same time, I think.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good moment to bring in a short quote I jotted down from the man himself, from Ildjarn, which is in his final statement. He says, "When listening to a record, I like to have the opportunity to create some kind of universe based on the sonic landscape I enter. If there is no landscape to be found, the release is not worth spending time on, and the artist or band reveal in this way the inability to create a one-of-a-kind sphere." What do you think about that?
I think that definitely speaks to what we're grasping at in the one of a kind universe statement, in that it's very easy to understand that statement as just sort of a random thing that a musician would say in an interview, as sort of not necessarily pretentious, but like just what they're aiming for. But I don't think you could. The thing that's striking about Ildjarn is we keep using these words like monotonous and drone and stuff, but of his iconic black metal albums, they're all strikingly different. I think even for someone that's not familiar with his work, they all come across as incredibly different statements of intent, despite the fact that they work on this very, very limited like territory sonically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sonic landscape is an interesting little phrase, because that's really how I listen to black metal, not just Ildjarn, but that's what I want to find in a record. I want it to kind of take me somewhere. It's kind of an imaginative experience, I guess, like reading fantasy, and it's no surprise that the likes of Burzum were inspired by that sort of thing as well. That's like fundamental to this kind of music and extreme metal in general, where often like singling out individual songs as being like way better than the rest of an artist is quite difficult usually, because an album front to back it's a sonic landscape. That's what I want to experience. It's got kind of texture. It might go somewhere, it might stay in the same place. In the case of Ildjarn, it stays in the same place, but that's what this kind of extreme crazy music does, and that's what I find interesting and appealing about it. I don't really get the criticism of extreme metal where it's like, yeah, but all the songs sound the same. Like, you're kind of missing the point, is how I would react to that. I don't know, is that fair? Is that kind of how you listen to music, or what?
Tyler, what are your thoughts?
I think that's roughly how I listen to music. I think that's actually a pretty damn close description of it. I mean, it's a common joke on this podcast, but I tend to go for, I said it almost word for word earlier, the kind of music that really strips down everything to just, how do I want to put it? Like a pure communication of sorts. There isn't a subtext through necessarily using certain kinds of aesthetics to communicate overtly to the listener that, to put it perhaps in an oversimplified way, this is the angry part, this is the sad part, or something like that. It's just purely the emotion that's found in the shift from one interval to another. And so I think that musicians who do that are, in a sense, kind of focusing almost entirely on what Shelley has referred to before as world building, which I think dovetails perfectly with what we're discussing here with Ildjarn and how you go about listening to an Ildjarn album.
Yeah, it's like it's worlds within worlds, and I don't want to point fingers because it gets a bit tiresome. But I guess like a lot of, say, post 2000, not just black metal but extreme metal in general, you get more options available in terms of the production techniques you can use, the synth patches you can deploy, the recording technology, and so on. And things sort of spiral to a point where you can basically express anything that comes to mind. And on paper that is a very good thing, but at the same time, extreme metal becomes so I'm gonna go on a rant about why it's not as good as it used to be, but that just makes me sound like it's just yeah. It's not that things aren't as good as they used to be. I'm a champion of a lot of modern metal, as listeners of the podcast will know. You know who you are. But it's more just I kind of like this self-limiting philosophy of Ildjarn. I mean, Mike, you mentioned earlier on that he was actually not a bad musician. It's not that he couldn't actually write stuff or play stuff that was slightly more complex, but he was deliberately self-limiting in that regard. And I think that is that speaks to this idea of world building, in that you are not trying to tell the listener, you're trying to show the listener, you're trying to create a place that they can inhabit and impose their own interpretation onto. And that's kind of, again, it speaks to the ambiguity of someone like Ildjarn as well. Whereas if you were to create like a very fully realized complete world, yes, it might be very compelling, but the listeners kind of, their hand is being held. And that's not to say you can't do it. Like, obviously we're talking, I don't know, you could mention bands like Emperor, bands like Summoning, bands that did it very, very well, in that there's a lot going on in their music, but at the same time, you can still explore it in a way that you could explore Ildjarn. So it's not something in particular that we're pointing to, something concrete. It's more just this general sense that you still leave something a little bit open-ended. And I suppose Ildjarn takes that to the ultimate extreme, where basically everything except for the raw sound and physicality and sort of motion of the music, everything else is just left completely up to the listener to decide where they want to go with it. And I think just speaking to that, I think most of what we said about forest poetry could probably be applied to Strength and Anger. Aside from the fact that I think Strength and Anger is somehow it's not quite as ironically it's not quite as angry as Forest Poetry. I think Forest Poetry is a more aggressive album, but Strength and Anger gets a more it's darker, it's more malevolent. It's all of the words around anger except for anger itself that I would describe. And also, of course, it is the namesake of this website in terms of the fact that it ends with 2 ambient tracks called Hate Meditations. But in itself, it is, I'd say it's like the expansion pack of Forest Poetry in a lot of ways, in that it unpacks a particular vibe that you get on Forest Poetry and then just explores that to a greater degree. And in a weird sense, I would say that Forest Poetry is like the daytime album, and Strength and Anger is like the nocturnal album that you kind of put on when you're sat around the fire and things are dark and the shadows are sort of dancing over the sort of firelight and stuff. Do you guys have anything to say about this album in particular before we move on to our boy Nidhogg?
Strength and Anger is the most esoteric Ildjarn album. It's the one that I listen to the least, although I deeply enjoy it. But while in some ways it is less sonically, less of a sonic assault than Forest Poetry, it almost uses texture more violently. In fact, the expectation that Ildjarn, being a more kind of ambient black metal band, utilizes texture to create ambient sound, I think is more found on Strength and Anger than perhaps any of his other full-length releases. In some ways, it almost touches on kind of an industrial noise approach, perhaps unintentionally. But it can be a very dense album to penetrate, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think this is just a small point, but I think in an interview, I think both Ildjarn and Nidhogg had name checked, say, industrial bands like Godflesh as having influenced their approach, which is like musically, there's not really an awful lot in common in terms of, the choices they make in terms of instrumentation, composition, aesthetics, and so on. But you can see kind of in the claustrophobic, dense, almost nihilistic, bleak atmosphere of something like Street Cleaner, you can kind of see where the link applies. So just a small point, but yeah.
Absolutely, and I wouldn't want to draw the connection too stridently, but something around Strength and Anger 6 and Strength and Anger 7, he sort of devolves into a noise track that I wouldn't sort of say directly references Godflesh, but it definitely references pretty much straight up noise music, in the fact that you get this sort of trance-like I want to say melody. I don't know if it is a melody. It's very malevolent anyway. And then that is just played over, again, another mid-paced blast beat or whatever. And then it devolves into Strength and Anger 7, where the drums drop out completely and it's just guitar noise. And you could say, it's influenced by, industrial or drone or noise rock or stuff like that. But Ildjarn would probably deny all of that and just say it's, as you said, Mike, he might have been sort of, caveating what he said about Godflesh or not, but like wherever it came from, it's sort of, there is a clear line between industrial inspired black metal and Ildjarn. I'm thinking of bands like Black Funeral as well. Some of the French black metal as well kind of attaches itself to industrial, and what eventually sort of wound up being things like Dark Space and things like that. I think they have a debt to bands like Ildjarn, even though Ildjarn will probably sort of detest that kind of music itself. But I think Strength and Anger is, as you put it, Tyler, it's like it's, despite the name, it is closer to ambient than Forest Poetry is. Forest Poetry is a very kind of, I almost treat it like a hardcore punk album in a lot of ways. It's very physical, you just get battered by it, whereas Strength and Anger I could stick on in the same way that I would stick on Transylvanian Hunger, for example, or this Lyset Tartos. It sort of sits in that canon for me, despite the fact that it might be slightly more like primal in that regard. But it's probably a misnamed album, but it's very, very kind of compelling in its ambient aspects.
I mean, do you think thinking about Ildjarn as primarily a black metal artist is in some way kind of unsatisfying, or is black metal even a bit of a misnomer here? Because there are certain tracks, especially when there's no guitar and you'll just get like a very simplistic drum pattern with a bass guitar heavily distorted kind of doing something for like 90 seconds and then it will finish, where it doesn't really have any attributes of black metal at all. And I think, you've mentioned the relationship with noise music. It's clearly there's an industrial influence. Many of the kind of touch points of black metal, like, double kick drums, or the creation of a kind of a mystical atmosphere through the use of kind of folk or kind of clean guitars, medieval type melodies or atmospheres, melodic leads, used sparingly. None of that is there. None of those attributes are present in Ildjarn's music. So I don't know, this may be a pedantic point, but is black metal a good way to describe Ildjarn? Is it dissatisfactory? What else would you say? Open question.
Tyler, I'll let you take this one.
That's an interesting question. I think that in some ways you're right that using black metal to describe Ildjarn is almost not exhaustive of what the experience you have when listening to Ildjarn. If you're thinking of black metal as a sort of compendium of a kind of formalized traits. But that being said, I also think that in some ways, Ildjarn walks heir to the throne, so to speak, of music like Bathory and Hellhammer and even Darkthrone, in utilizing precedents they established in perhaps more extreme ways, things that those bands were touching at with long, almost ambient flowing tremolo themes that kind of reduce music to a flow of melody are done by Ildjarn in an album format rather than a song format. So Ildjarn kind of sits in this interesting middle ground where they're both reaching beyond black metal, but also at the same time fulfilling a lot of its promise, in my opinion.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that, and I think that was what I was trying to allude to in my introduction, in that I was trying to explain that he is one of these artists that makes me fundamentally reevaluate my understanding of not just black metal, but of music. And in trying to kind of talk my way around the pretension of that statement, it is kind of what you're getting at, in that he is picking up he is the logical conclusion of the black metal project in a lot of ways. The second wave in particular, as it kind of came out of your Hellhammer, Celtic Frost and Bathory's and emerged into Mayhem and Darkthrone, particularly around 93, 94. And the artists themselves, the artists got really big off that, just veered off into their own direction, and they couldn't find a way out of it without sort of reaching back to either death metal or classic heavy metal, or adding additional kind of orchestration and stuff. And some of that was undeniably successful, but I think Ildjarn was the one that really grabbed the idea of black metal in its purest sense and said, no, let's take this to its logical extreme. And in that sense, he basically took black metal to its avant-garde in a way that something like the La Légion Noire kind of failed to do, although I do have a lot of respect for that scene, obviously, in particular Mutilation and things like that. But he took that to an extreme that those bands were kind of unable to interpret in a lot of ways, because, as you kind of said, Tyler, he understood what made certain runs and certain passages in, say, Bathory's The Return, or early Darkthrone circa Under a Funeral Moon. He kind of expanded on that. He's like the expansion pack to that, and really kind of gouged open that wound and decided, well, what is within that little pocket of creativity, and let's expand on that and see if we can kind of see what happens, essentially. And it turns out that a lot of people don't appreciate it, but at the same time, there is a sort of chosen. Not chosen, that's a horrible word to say. There's a chosen few of people that understand it. There's a handful of people that it definitely resonates with to some extent, and yeah, we might be a little bit wrong-headed for doing so, but there is something there, and yeah, his legacy is kind of uh, it does kind of it captures something that I think people keep coming back to and saying, sort of needing to say, no, this is irredeemably shit, and they keep needing to say it, but there is something there that keeps people coming back. And just to that point as well, sorry, do you want to come in on that?
I was just going to make the point that I like, what you said about Ildjarn almost being the logical conclusion of like a process that sort of starts with Bathory, and by the time you get to Ildjarn, it's like what's left to strip away. There's almost nothing. Yeah, I find that interesting, and I find it hard to grasp why someone who's interested in this music in a deep way wouldn't be interested in the thought process that gets you to that point and what the artistic end product is. Like, I can't imagine wanting to dismiss that entirely. It's just a strange way of thinking. That was my reaction when I was reading some of those negative reviews of forest poetry, for example. You could say it's too long an album. I think that's a fair criticism.
It's because they're not true, Mike. They're not true.
Well, I just don't know how you end up listening to black metal and not being interested in something like Ildjarn, like where it goes. It's what are you like? What brought you to this? Because if it wasn't the extremity, what the hell was it? Or the kind of the strangeness and the bizarre nature of it in comparison to the vast majority.
I think that people.
Yeah, anyway,
the number one criticism I've seen of Ildjarn is not even entirely related to the music itself, although of course it involves it. The number one criticism I've seen of Ildjarn is the praise that Ildjarn receives. People seem to feel that Ildjarn is frequently lauded as something deeply intellectual and profound, and they think that is a stark contrast, that kind of praise, to the actual music. And so they feel that it is a case of people who are pompously intellectual taking something that is, in truth, just as noisy and extreme as it can possibly be, making it nearly impenetrable and difficult for other people to be able to discern, and dressing it up as something that it's not, so they can have a feigned feeling of superiority. Now, my response to that is pretty simple. Why the hell would I care about that? I'm almost 40 years old. I really don't care if other people see me as intellectual or not. Most of my social circle isn't even really aware of my musical tastes, but people are going to insist on that because most people think in largely social terms. So they think that everything that you do is motivated by how it makes you look in a social concours.
Awesome.
Yes.
So,
can I just come in with a very small point about in reaction to the criticism?
I hear the rustling of paper, which means you've got something
got
printed
notes.
out.
Oh, I was writing some things down.
He's got notes.
Oh, if you could see them, there's like an Ildjarn lyric sheet. It's going to be burnt straight after this. In a sort of being in a necro state of mind, I believe is the phrase. But yeah, just I guess in reaction to people's criticism that by analyzing this music in this way, we're turning it to something kind of intellectual and profound. I see Ildjarn's music as profoundly anti-intellectual, but that doesn't mean it can't be profound or result in a profound experience for the listener. And I think one of the chief criticisms of Ildjarn is that, it's just some guy playing two power chords with the worst microphone he could find, and this is talentless. Anyone could do this. If that were true, there would be dozens of albums out there that sound like forest poetry. Like, if they're out there, like, I've never heard them, to be honest. Like, are there any Ildjarn clones that even come close to approximating what is going on, like, experientially on forest poetry? Do you guys know of any? Because I haven't come across it.
There are some that try, but like I said in the introduction, Ildjarn got absorbed into this sort of raw black metal phenomenon, which is more like bands like Bonal and things where they get that Ildjarn did something, but they don't quite know how to mimic it. Even mimic it, I would say. Like, they don't, let alone reaching to the underlying philosophy that we've been discussing for the last hour or so. They don't even know how to get to the surface level, which is surprising given that, as you just said, Mike, it's 2 or 3 power chords delivered on the shittest mic ever. There's as Tyler would say, there's a gestalt to these albums that is just imitatable.
Well, like I said earlier, that's the genius of it, is that there is almost, in a sense, more talent required to do more with less, to be able to. It's a talent that is something that you also see in Burzum to a large extent, of being able to take something minimalistic and become a master of shaping emotion through it. And Ildjarn definitely is one of those calibers of geniuses. What's interesting about comparing Ildjarn and Burzum in this particular context is that Burzum at least has a small handful of competent imitators in varying degrees. If you think of something like I Shall Become at their best, they were, to some extent, relatively a competent imitator of Burzum's style. And there's a few other bands I could list as well. Ildjarn has almost...
I'd say Judas Iscariot to some
yeah,
extent.
Judas Iscariot.
Judas Iscariot, amalgamation of Burzum and Dark Throne.
But Ildjarn has almost none. You like the one that immediately came to my mind was the one you already mentioned, Shelley, which is Bonal, and I don't think Bonal even really approaches Ildjarn. I don't know if I would even call them a competent imitator, and that's not even necessarily to trash on Bonal. I'm not saying that they're not good at what they do when they're doing it well, but it still doesn't really approach the level of quality that Ildjarn has.
Yeah, I guess it's there are there are plenty of albums that I sort of think are maybe even unconsciously referencing Ildjarn, but I think it takes a special kind of anti-music mentality to do what Ildjarn does, and I think to some extent, and again, not to trash on modern bands, but modern bands are just fundamentally way more musically talented than they used to be. The level of musicianship is much higher. The recording technology that people have access to is much better quality, and that allows musicians to basically let their imaginations wander. And not that Ildjarn didn't have access to better quality material in the mid to late 90s, but those limitations were an asset to some extent, but also just the guts that it takes to release music that primitive now kind of exposes yourself to accusations of being anti-music in some sense, in a way that is not approximate to noise that we were talking about earlier, because Ildjarn still has a rhythm section, ostensibly, vocals, guitar. There is still the kind of shadow or the framework of music being sort of trying to articulate itself, but he makes a point of just not fully articulating it. And I think if a musician was to do that in this day and age, they would, in some sense, find themselves a little bit embarrassed to be doing that in a way, because the standards of musicianship are that much higher and the standards of recording are that much higher. It's not like it leans into the raw black metal aesthetic in a way that a Titan Blood does or something. It's I don't know. It's the worst of all possible worlds in a way, aesthetically speaking, from a sort of modern extreme metal sort of fan's mindset, I suppose.
There's probably also a fairly mundane point about how the albums were recorded. I believe they were all done on the same 4-track recorder that Wrath of the Tyrant was recorded on.
Yes, yeah.
So he's using technology that is now several decades obsolete. So if you to even try and get that sound, and God knows what microphones he was using, it's not something you can digitally recreate very easily. So there's probably an element of that to it as well. That's one of the things I would say that's very, very stark about all of his full-length releases, actually, in the metal genre, is just how fucking unique they sound, like, production-wise. I know people say the production sucks, and I suppose it does, but when you listen to the first demo he put out, is it 7 Harmonies of Unknown Truth, something like that? It sounds like a black metal demo that any black metal artist was kind of releasing at the time. It's all a bit muddy, everything sounds a bit far away. But on the studio albums, you get a sort of underproduction of a very different kind. It's much more deliberate because I guess he spent more time on it. But it's not something I've heard elsewhere, anywhere. Maybe it's just a very banal point about the hardware he was using. Other people weren't, and certainly aren't now. Any reaction to that? Do you think that the production values of forest poetry, for example, are unique, or are they available in any number of raw black metal albums?
Well, I'm still ostensibly in a band. I still have a lot of kind of attachment to modern recording techniques, and obviously I listen to a lot of newer metal. And my instinct is to say yes, you could absolutely replicate the general like vibe of an album like Forest Poetry. My point previously was just that I think most bands would sort of feel a little bit undignified in doing that. And just to sort of elaborate on that point a bit, you mentioned Wrath of the Tyrant and the link with Emperor. I would say the production on the Wrath of the Tyrant demo is fucking absolutely atrocious. Like, it's far worse than anything I've heard Ildjarn put out. That it, not just in terms of like, oh, it's not encapsulating what Emperor are trying to express. No, I think just rudimentarily speaking, it is way worse than you would expect from a Forest Poetry or a Strength and Anger and so on. But it's hailed as like a classic. I mean, to some extent, you could say the same thing about an album like Battles in the North. I don't think that's much worse. Or sorry, I don't think Ildjarn is much worse than what you'd find on something like Battles in the North. I think the real affront that Ildjarn represents to extreme metal sensibilities is the fact that he refuses to do things like harmonies, key changes, like basic events or anything like that. Or as Tyler was talking about earlier on, with something like Burzum, he's not imitatable. Ildjarn is just not. You can't imitate a 2-3 power chord riff for 3 minutes. You can't imitate that kind of atmosphere that he's getting at, because Burzum had a particular melodic signature that you could, in theory, kind of make a reasonable simulation of. Famously, Transylvanian Hunger, one of the most influential and imitated black metal albums probably ever, is incredibly like mimicable. It's memeable. You can transpose that format onto anything. But something like Strength and Anger or Forest Poetry is, in its aggressive like rejection of even the hint of melody that Transylvanian Hunger paid lip service to, just makes it so so anti imitatable. That's not a word, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yep, well expressed. Do you want to move on to talk about some of the ambient bits?
Thank you, Mike. That was not well expressed, but I do want to move on to some of the ambient bits. So, in between these classic albums that we're talking about, Ildjarn thought it fit to release Landscapes. Which is, again, in a very similar way to the black metal albums. It's an affront to ambient in that it is basically 3 notes droning around on one synthesizer. And I was, before we started recording this episode today, I was looking it up, because until 2020, I was the only guy to have reviewed that album. I posted my review back in 2011, and then some nugget posted a review in 2020 and just bumped up its average score. I actually gave it 55%, which I probably would have given it more in this day and age, but back in 2011 I wasn't a fan. But that's because it follows a very, very similar framework to his metal work, in that it is that singular meditation on just one idea, and the fact that it's a double disc It stretches like I think well beyond 2 hours in its entirety. It is a slog to get through, even from an ambient point of view. And I think people expecting again something similar to the Burzum ambient albums, something like One Graven, something like Neptune Towers. Take your pick of the sort of ambient side projects of black metal artists. They're expecting something similar, but no, Ildjarn pulls it out the bag again and just delivers 2 hours of utter drone. And I think this is where I'll invite your comments on landscapes in a second, but this is where Nidhogg, as the kind of, in many people's eyes, the savior of Ildjarn comes in, because it's their other ambient album that they do in collaboration that is really kind of the standout moment for a lot of fans of like the ambient black metal adjacent material. But do you have any comments on landscapes before we sort of get into the nitty gritty of that?
It's an album I enjoy immensely. Sorry,
Oh,
Tyler,
wow.
go for
Well,
it.
this is going to be an interesting contrast. I like, in some ways, landscapes, but as it's funny because while with the black metal part of Ildjarn, I enjoy the droning, slow shift of tones. Uh, Landscapes I enjoy less than the more kind of lush and varied Hardanger Vita, or however you pronounce that album. And Landscapes is arguably the ambient piece by Ildjarn that is a closer relation to his black metal. You would think that would be the one I would gravitate towards, but I feel like with the ambient palette, like instrumental palette, so to speak, that it actually that kind of droning approach becomes limited in a way. It the Without the kind of raw textures of the black metal aesthetic, it loses some of its power and ends up kind of how do I want to put it? Becoming kind of just an exercise in the relation of sounds that doesn't really communicate as much as his black metal works do or as his other ambient works do. But anyway, Mike, please carry on.
Yeah. I think what appeals to me about that album is, in contrast to Hardanger Vida, which feels like it has moments that are almost anthemic and majestic in a way, which is not something you really come across in Ildjarn's metalwork. Landscape feels like a companion piece in a strange way, even though the first thing that I reacted to about Landscapes was its difference to his metal. That's kind of what got me interested in Ildjarn, was that I heard back to back the eponymous album and then this, and I was just thinking, hang on, how can this be the same artist? I do think they have similar artistic ambitions. Ildjarn's spoken in interviews a lot about his absolute kind of admiration for and worship of nature and being alone in nature. Now, we don't know to what extent that plays through in the metal, in the lyrics to his metal, because I think he burnt most of the lyrics in a fire and they weren't published, to my knowledge. Maybe you can fact check that, I don't know. But certainly with Landscapes as kind of a sort of tribute to kind of the Norwegian, the northern Norwegian mountains and so on. That feeling of stillness, minimalism, this utter kind of eternity seems to pass as you listen to that album. You've pointed out that it's long; it probably feels longer, but to me, it does evoke that sort of epic, unchanging stillness of a mountainous landscape in somewhere cold, northern, largely untouched by humankind. It has an almost alien quality to it, quite unfeeling. There's not much emotion expressed through it, and I think that is something that is different on Hardanger Vida. So the minimalism of it stands in stark contrast to the work with Nidhogg, I would say. That's my reaction to it. I get a lot out of it as a listening experience, though. Having said that, it's an album that I can put on and it feels like all the kind of puny, petty bullshit in life just disappears. I don't know. I find it weirdly therapeutic, but I think a lot of people find it quite boring. So, I don't know what that says about me, but those are my reactions, incoherent and unstructured, but there you go. Any thoughts in reaction to that?
Much like Landscapes itself. No, I'd agree that he invokes this alien atmosphere to it, and yeah, the moment he hits the first synth note, it's not like he's doing anything in particular. It's a standard synthesizer. He's playing 3 notes most per track, but there is something going on that is comparable to the black metal work in that again it is sort of this meditation, this almost monomaniacal exploration of very, very basic ideas. And yeah, I think you're right, Mike, in that you could say you almost lose sense of time. You feel like you're just floating through this sort of weird, nebulous sort of zone. And it does sort of really speak to the wilderness that he's trying to invoke. But I think you really hit the nail on the head when you described the Ildjarn Nidhogg album as anthemic, because that's an album that, unlike the Ildjarn metal albums, which I described like being able to tell individual tracks apart on something like Forest Poetry, and maybe elements of Strength and Anger, but in general, an Ildjarn album just flows. The you guys have pronounced it like 5 times, and I'm just gonna struggle. Hardanger Vida album is almost like, by comparison, a pop album. Like, I remember individual tracks from that, like Fleeing Herd, Daybreak, fucking Frozen Plain. Like, I remember these tracks because they are so distinctive and memorable. In a good way. They're really like enthralling, captivating pieces of ambient work, but they are also, in terms of their sort of catchiness and memorability, they are pop tracks compared to what Ildjarn does on his metal work, which I find really sort of compelling in a way. That is sort of the album itself is so much more like eventful than what Ildjarn kind of creates on what is ostensibly like more like energetic, eventful music. But the ambient work that he does with his longtime pal Nidhogg is like more, I don't know, just it ingrains in my memory a bit more, and some of those tracks are just much more distinctive. Again, it might be because they gave them English language titles, but.
I do think that piece Daybreak, which is like track 2 or 3 on Hardanger Vida, it really stuck out to me like a sore thumb when I first heard it, because I'm like, am I listening to a record with Ildjarn on the front cover at this point? It's melodic, really melodic. It's kind of ambient, but it has like a beat to it.
There's this power ballad percussion
really accessible.
Going on.
You could probably put this on.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah.
Play it to my parents, for God's sake.
It's got these kind of longer melodic phrases. Yeah, you could play it in most contexts, and people, it's kind of a nice piece of music. And I find that really jarring. I'm not sure whether that detracts from the experience or not. I don't know. I'm kind of a bit ambivalent about that track. I almost find it too optimistic sounding when I'm so used to the more minimal kind of coldness of the other kind of ambient stuff.
Well, not to throw you off too much, but what about Hardanger Vida Part 2? Have you listened to that?
Yeah, so that's the companion EP, isn't it? I'm not as familiar with it. So would you say that continues, that feels similar to the sort of Daybreak type feel?
Yeah, this is where it gets, I don't want to say amateurish, but there's a track on there called The Troll Dome that is a little bit like point and click RPG kind of. You have reached the village. Would you like to talk to the villagers? Kind of tone to it, where it's got this really cheap drum machine, this very, very corny melody, and I love it for all of its like amateurishness, because it embodies a lot of that early dungeon synth vibe to it, but it's also like it really should have probably been not released in a lot of ways. But anyway,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
um,
I mean, clearly the kind of paying tribute to nature through music is a hugely important part of these projects, and it just strikes me that forest poetry. Okay, we're talking about something that's reacting to the harsh, kind of primitive, cold feeling of Norwegian nature. It's very, very disturbing. It's harsh. It's nihilistic. At the other end of the spectrum, we get something like Daybreak, which again, ostensibly, we're talking about the same artist's reaction to the same thing, the kind of grandeur of Norwegian nature. They're very, very different feelings. And maybe that just reflects that as an artist, you don't feel the same way all the time. As a human being, you don't react to things in the same way all the time. But if you see one of the main objectives of the Ildjarn project is to kind of pay tribute to or react to nature in some way, artistically represent the feelings of the nature that he's surrounded with in Norway, they're poles apart, right? So they've reached very different conclusions. I find that tension a bit unsettling. I'm not sure how to resolve it. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Who else is thinking about this sort of thing all the time?
well, I don't know. Like,
if you guys are.
I'm not as a sort of guy that lives in like a big urban sprawl. I'm not attached to nature in the same way that Ildjarn is, but I've gone for hikes where nature seems very, very threatening, and I've woken up on campsites where nature is just a ball ache and a pain to deal with. But then I've woken up in nature where it is very, very enriching and almost like intoxicating in a lot of ways. And I think I don't want to read into him, his psychology or whatever, but I suspect he's getting at the fact that experiencing nature in the raw is a very violent, visceral, unpleasant experience day to day, and much like we don't appreciate in our environments, like it is just nature is hostile, or it appears hostile, or it feels hostile, but equally on a track like Daybreak or whatever, you get these moments where you just you do sit down and you maybe take in your landscape, and you are just transfixed, and it's a little bit like, I don't know, taking a big old huff on a joint or something. You just get this moment of complete serenity where you do feel I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it. You do feel at one with the world around you. I don't know. Tyler, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think that you're really onto something. I mean, I was really actually fascinated by your description about the different experiences of nature, because all too often when people talk about the beauty or the majesty of nature, they're thinking about something that's particularly pleasing from a anthropocentric view, something that's harmonious, something that is aesthetically pleasant to look upon. But I don't think that is an appreciation of nature in the way that the music of Ildjarn understands it. I think Ildjarn almost sees nature as a complex system of sorts that involves many different attributes that, while some may be violent, some may be even almost disgusting or repulsive, and some may even be tedious, boring, or mundane, all serve a certain function. And the fact that all of these things serve a function, that all of these things contribute to the system rather than being a hiccup or a sort of malfunction within it. I think the music of Ildjarn communicates that such a thing is awe-inspiring in a way. I think that kind of speaks to the deeper theme of Ildjarn and the reason why the people who admire his music find it so powerful and so compelling.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about sort of the thing you mentioned about the anthropocentric view of nature compared to looking at it in a more abstract way. Because that's something that I really appreciate about Ildjarn's metal works and his solo ambient works, is there's this feeling that nature is being maybe portrayed in some way artistically, but it's not putting the human being at the center of that experience. It's like it's sort of depicting nature as kind of detached, alien, cold, eternal, and totally unconcerned with the kind of petty day-to-day concerns of human survival. And that's what I like about it. I think that's great. And that's why with the Hardangervidda stuff, when you get to tracks that feel almost like they are a bit more expressing of the majesty of nature. The track Daybreak, you kind of almost get the sense of like that's a reaction to watching daybreak over the mountains. It's this kind of awe-inspiring experience, kind of joyful experience, which I find kind of jarring with what's going on in the rest of his discography. And in some way, it's something that's slightly put me off that record. Yeah, I don't know. Just some thoughts there.
So, given the current comments that we're making, what do we make of Nidhogg's influence on Ildjarn? Because some would argue that Ildjarn made his best works because of Nidhogg, or arguably even Nidhogg was responsible for those works. I'm thinking, again, Discog a little bit messy, but there is a rarities compilation where Ildjarn and Nidhogg are said to collaborate. There's a few other compilations where they put together work. I'm going to set aside Sort Vodka for now. We'll come to that in a moment. But in terms of the Ildjarn Nidhogg kind of material, where basically you get the more melodic black metal, not in the sort of melodic black metal in the sense of like in the way that we normally understand it, but in a melodic by Ildjarn's standards. But as you were referring to, Mike, it could be that Nidhogg's influence is him anthropocenterizing things in terms of instead of nature being this hostile force that you kind of just encounter and decide how to deal with, he is placing the individual at the heart of it, and they're experiencing nature as you would I don't know, a traveler or a hiker or someone that's just like out for a jaunt and experiencing it and taking joy in it, rather than someone that has to fucking live in it and survive in it and so on. Is that where we're going with this, or do we see Ildjarn as like do we see Nidhogg as like a tempering force on the rougher edges of Ildjarn, and together they sort of collaborate to make quite profound works? I don't know. What's your interpretation of their collaboration? Either one of you, Tyler or Mike.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, it's interesting as a kind of the idea of a temper or a foil to Ildjarn's kind of more extreme tendencies. I hadn't really thought of it in that way. I mean, I do think that Nidhogg, seemingly, from what little we know about him, seems to be a bit more of a kind of pragmatic individual who kind of, inhabits a reality quite different to Ildjarn's. The stuff they did on like the Norse EP, for example, and some of the other shorter EPs, I think is very, very effective. I kind of wish there was a bit more of it. It's a cleaner sound, like the metal sound I say is clean. I mean, we're still talking, black metal, so it's kind of it's harsh sounding music, but it's a much cleaner recording standard. I think it's fair to say, use of drum machine. Obviously, I can't fact check that completely, but I think they use a drum machine on that EP, for example, Norse, and some of the other stuff as well. And that gives it a slightly more clinical quality, whereas I'd see Ildjarn's black metal as really very, very organic. So that marks it out as different. It hasn't got quite the same level of brutal simplicity to it, although it is still quite simple raw black metal. I really like the vocal style on those records, so I have to say, really, really effective, harsh, kind of raspy screams. Very, very cool. But other than Norse and Svartfrad, I'm not sure I know exactly what to attribute to Nidhogg in the sort of mush of Ildjarn compilations. I find it all a bit too confusing.
No, it gets hazy. I just assume that anything with a melody in is Nidhogg. I know that's
yeah. There's the two really famous tracks from the Ildjarn Nidhogg compilation that everybody's a really big fan of, that are kind of a sort of a meeting place between Ildjarn's stripped down ambient flow approach and a very lush harmonic sense of melody that I'm almost certain is mostly Nidhogg. In fact, I wonder if Ildjarn even really had anything to do with those tracks at all. I know he's not doing the vocals. It doesn't sound like the tortured screams of Ildjarn. And
I think it may be just lyrics, possibly just lyrics. I think I read in an interview with Nidhogg that mentions somewhere that Ildjarn had contributed mainly lyrics to some of their
Yeah,
collaborations. Yeah,
and they're
just
good.
for what it's
They're
worth.
good pieces. But um, while I appreciate Nidhogg's contributions to Ildjarn, I think that, for instance, with the ambient works, the Hardanger Vita is my favorite. Um, and those tracks that I mentioned from the Ildjarn Nidhogg compilation are very good. Um, I really think that overall, in my opinion, Nidhogg is the weaker element of the two. For instance, I've heard, I don't know if it's been confirmed, but the Those Once Mighty split, is that what it's called? Uh,
Those ones,
yeah,
Mighty Fallen with
right.
Hate
That
Forest.
most of that material I think I heard was Nidhogg composed. Um,
Yes, Iljan
right,
had nothing to do with
exactly.
it.
And it's not that strong of a release, you know. Um,
It's
right,
so-so.
exactly. So while I think that Nidhogg does have some exceptional talent in some ways, I feel like in sum total, he's actually a weaker composer than Ildjarn is.
Yeah, I mean, um, I think from my point of view, it's sort of I'm trying to think of a sort of collaboration that's kind of comparable, but they do temper each other's um, like extremities in that they're strongest when they are together. In that Nidhogg is, yeah, you're absolutely right. My understanding is that the Those Once Mighty Fallen EP split with Hate Forest was Iljan had nothing to do with that. He denies all knowledge of it. I don't know if it was Nidhogg conclusively, but I'm pretty sure it was. I haven't read the latest on it. I haven't read about it since it came out, so correct me on that. But even going back to the stuff that Nidhogg was a part of, i.e., the Nidhogg EP, and some of the stuff that he did with Iljan, is he was definitely on the more melodic, mesmerizing end of black metal, and he was very, very talented at sort of crafting that. Whereas obviously Iljan was all of the things that we've already discussed, in that he was a very unique architect of primal black metal, and both of them together, by their powers combined, created a very unique, like, version of black metal. He's a little bit like I don't know. Immortal or Darkthrone or Immolation or any of the other classic duos of extreme metal that you could name. They created something quite unique, but Iljan and Nidhogg obviously much less solidly than those outfits. Um, so in that regard, Nidhogg definitely deserves praise. But I think that he deserves praise most for his ability to work with what is ostensibly one of the most notoriously like misanthropic, uh, idiosyncratic musicians of Norwegian black metal, I suppose, and sort of harnessing some of that power to create things that were like, yeah, we mentioned some of the compilations it was on, the Ildjarn Nidhogg compilation as well being one of them, and the Hardanger Ambient album, which were all like unique moments within black metal. I know that we have our misgivings on them, but they were really, really quite profound. Excuse me. I think one thing we need to finish on, obviously, because otherwise people will say, discuss sword vodka. We need to discuss sword vodka. Um, and their one and only album, Folkloric Necrometal, which I've been hesitating to introduce into this because it is anomalous in so many ways. In that it is anomalous in that it is one of my favorite black metal albums. I'll be just put that at the top of this segment. It's one of my favorite black metal albums ever released. It is one of the most typical black metal albums that Ildjarn ever appeared on. It is also one of the most populous black metal albums that Ildjarn ever appeared on, in that there was a member or two that were not Nidhogg, and he agreed to appear on it. And I understand from what I remember of the final statement is that he fucking hated working on it, because not only did he have to work with other people, but the other people were smoking weed the whole time, and he did not appreciate that. And it's also one of those albums that's kind of gone down in history as like one of the best black metal albums of the late 90s, but also one of the most kind of, if you know, you know, albums. And I think that's kind of, it's entirely appropriate given its clientele and given its actual sound, in that there are tracks on there that could well belong on an Ildjarn album in terms of their primitivism, their aggression, their just atonal kind of just assault on the listener. But at the same time, it ends with an ambient track that could have belonged on an Ildjarn Nidhogg compilation. It's one of the most beautiful and sort of meditative pieces of music that you'll hear. There are moments on there that touch on sort of this Burzum-esque, like trance-like, meditative, almost like hypnotic form of repetitive melodies that they have going. It's a very, very strange album for mid-90s black metal in and of itself, even if you discount the fact that a character like Ildjarn was involved. Tyler, what are your thoughts on folkloric necro metal? Even the name just cracks me up, for fuck's sake.
Metal rules. Freaking love that album. I'm glad you brought up the THC thing. They even mentioned that in the liner notes, which led to some confusion. I think in the DLA interview with Ildjarn, they brought that up, like, hey, the album says in the liner notes that this was produced under the influence of THC, so how was partaking in that? And Ildjarn gave a very foul-natured response about how he didn't do any of that and everybody else did, and you could tell he was probably a little bit irritated by that. But a really amusing thing to picture mentally, a bunch of other major black metal musicians getting high and Ildjarn being really pissed. But
just making a fire or something.
But yeah, interestingly enough, even though in some ways folkloric necro metal is, as you said, got some radical differences from Ildjarn's other material, I actually think that parts of the music lead me to believe that he was more involved than just playing what other people told him to. I feel like there are some legitimate allusions to Ildjarn's solo music, at least briefly, in the DNA of folkloric necro metal. Obviously, there's some influences in there from, Emperor and other such artists too. But you do get some of that raw ambient flow black metal happening over the course of the album. So it does make me wonder if he was a bit more involved compositionally than just being present.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I take, much like anything Varg says, I take what Ildjarn says with a pinch of salt. But yeah, I absolutely think he was probably more involved in that. But I think it's interesting sort of watching him sort of metabolize how to work with other musicians, because it's the only one, as far as I'm aware, other than Nidhogg and obviously Valshot suffered, the only time that he had to work with other musicians, and it's just straight up some of the best material he put down, aside from sort of the classic Ildjarn albums that we were discussing earlier. Sorry, Mike, your thoughts on folkloric necro metal?
Yeah, I mean, I think they went into the studio because one of the musicians who appears on the album worked there, and they had a sort of 48-hour period to record something. And I think as a consequence, it was recorded very hurriedly, and they were kind of composing sort of on the fly and recording things in one or two takes. Now, that's not unusual for an Ildjarn solo record. I think that's how he worked anyway. But you get the impression that when you add an extra three musicians to the mix, to do things in that way results in a certain degree of kind of compromise. And I do think it's a fantastic record. It's a fascinating record. It's really unusual, and it's highly experimental. I don't know that it quite hangs together perfectly. You do get the feeling that it's like a selection of tracks rather than something that kind of flows well together and was kind of conceived as an album. Having said that, I absolutely love the fact that the guitar just sounds like static. It sounds like they just plugged it straight into the desk. There's just like no tone to it whatsoever. It's basically just static noise. That's the guitar tone. They use a drum machine again, which I don't love, but it kind of works here. It gives it that very kind of clinical, kind of cold quality to it. There's this keyboard, which is something that doesn't appear in any of Ildjarn's kind of black metal stuff, is having keyboard layered on top of it, which almost floats above the music, gives it this very ethereal kind of floaty quality to it, very trippy, kind of suitably. And so I think it's an experiment. There's a degree of compromise going on, but when it really works, you get some of the most unique sounding kind of late 90s black metal that you're going to find. And that closer, that ambient closer, where it's just these kind of a couple of very simple melodies that overlap, almost like a kind of Brian Eno discrete music sort of thing. I find that really effective. It closes out what is quite a short album. I mean, if you wanted an entry point to Ildjarn, this might not be a bad one because you don't have to sit through 70 minutes of music. So yeah,
70 minutes of torture.
Some reactions. Exactly. Yeah, this is less torturous. Still quite torturous. I mean, let's be honest. We're not talking Top of the Pops, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That it is possible tracks that are pure Ildjarn, where it's just unbridled rage. But at the same time, it has some of the most beautiful material that you will find in the Ildjarn discography, including the ambient albums as well. But also, I just wanted to quiz as a final thought, the drum machine comment you made, because I think some of the compilation material he did with Nidhogg, and maybe the Ildjarn, maybe not the pure Ildjarn material, but the stuff he did with Nidhogg definitely was drum machine led. And you get the sense they were using the same drum machine for the sort of Vodka album as well. And for my mind, I've come across many black metal bands that do use a drum machine. Some don't. I'm ambiguous. I'm agnostic. Sorry, towards it. Being a goth, I'm fully behind the use of a drum machine if it works artistically, or even if it works as a sort of necessity. I'm not really kind of a drummer faithful, but at the same time, I really appreciate like watching the drums being played well, because they're an instrument that I really don't understand, and when I watch a drummer doing their craft well, I really appreciate it. But for something like this, which is very kind of I guess for want of a better word, what we've been grasping at is experimental and kind of sculpted music, in that it's very deliberate and very intentional in the way that it's crafted, in that every single element needs to fit into where it needs to be. It does really, really fit the idea that a drum machine needs to just be there to keep the pace. It's a little bit like Fenriz's attitude to playing drums to Transylvanian Hunger, is that the drums aren't supposed to do anything other than just be there. They don't need to do anything else. And that is kind of the something of an ethos that I've kind of carried over in terms of that level of black metal is kind of the drums just need to do the thing and also like be an ambient drumming, an ambient kind of rhythmic piece. And I feel like the drum machine that Ildjarn employs, and to some extent other bands have employed, really, really works. But I also still detect a very, very anti-drum machine mentality in a lot of modern extreme metal, despite the fact that it is ostensibly kind of experimental and stuff. What are your thoughts on, like, maybe I don't want to end on the idea of a drum machine, but what are your thoughts on the organicism of Ildjarn and whether he would have benefited from a drum machine to use it more extensively, or whether you feel like other bands would sort of benefit from that kind of self-limitation, I suppose, that a drum machine engenders, and that you can't do fancy time shifts and so on.
I'm in the firmly no camp whether Ildjarn's kind of solo metal things would have been enhanced by the use of programmed drums. I don't think I don't think you could get a drum machine to play exactly like he does on those metal releases. I really don't. There's something almost like too simplistic to it, almost like too human about it. The problem with like drum machines is that because every hi-hat hit sounds the same and every kick drums, when you program beats that are really fast, as they often have to be in black metal, it sounds almost comedic to me, like it's just too precise. Like it slightly takes away from the fact that everything else is really freewheeling and kind of sloppy. It seems it's a strange counterpoint to have these really precise drums where like I say, every eighth note on the hi-hat sounds the same or whatever, and then meanwhile the guitar player's doing something that just sounds like a pure wall of noise, like it's not precise in any way. So yeah, I mean, I find the counterpoint strange in metal, and I think that's, I guess, one of the criticisms that people had in death metal when people started using triggered kick drums and so on, and it caused a stir, a minor diplomatic incident about that, which I kind of see the point in that when you get the really clicky kick drums and every kick is triggering the identical same kick drum pattern. Like, I don't get what that adds to it. To me, that takes away from the chaos that I expect in extreme metal. So those are some thoughts.
Tyler, you have any thoughts?
Thoughts on the drum machine?
Drum machine.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes a drum machine to me is, in the case of something like Godflesh, and an addition to the music. It adds to the thematic elements. Other times, I think they're used well enough that you almost can't tell that the drum machine is being used. With Ildjarn, my gut instinct makes me lean towards organicism being preferred to something more mechanical. But that being said, Ildjarn's percussion is so almost seemingly intentionally simplistic that it almost seems to me like a secondary concern when it comes to his music. I feel like he was really taking that element of black metal. Everybody knows the famous Fenrir quote. In black metal, the drums should just be there. And kind of...
That's what I alluded to earlier. Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
I think
he's fucking right,
exactly.
though.
And I think Ildjarn's really kind of taking that to its extreme, a la what we were discussing earlier about him advancing other elements of black metal to their extreme, or to their logical conclusion.
Yeah, I think I think for Ildjarn, it depends what you're looking for, and I think that kind of speaks to what albums we were discussing, in that something like Strength and Anger, maybe Program Drums work on that because it is more of an industrial album. Something like Forest Poetry, I feel like, although it is every bit as like repetitive and mechanical, and you could easily program drums for that, it just works having a real drummer there because it is so organic. And then everything else, I don't know, I don't feel like a program drums or a real drummer would make you like it or love it or hate it any more or less, because I feel like all of the sort of material that's going to make you have a normative judgment on it is already there to some extent, because Ildjarn is so upfront with whether he wants you to like it or not that you've already kind of made up your mind by that point. So I'm just going to do a little preamble to the close. So I don't think I could have discussed Ildjarn with any two people more qualified than this. Before I stop recording, do you want to make any comments on Ildjarn, the man? I'm going to edit this bit out if you want, but his final statement, his persona, anything like that, or we can stop recording right now.
I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, well, we don't know very much about him. From the brief interviews he gave, he's deeply misanthropic, desired to live in solitude, all these sorts of things. I'm always a bit unsure with this sort of underground music, like how seriously to take some of these statements and how literally to take some of them. We don't know anything about the guy's personal life, what he does for a job, so on and so forth. So you can only kind of speculate, and how far you take him seriously is, I guess, is up to you. The final statement, this sort of freewheeling, several thousand words of just incoherent rambling, really contains a lot of points that seem immensely petty. Like he seems personally very aggrieved, and he feels in some way personally spited that the other Norwegian black metal musicians who were around at the time were not, in what I guess he would say, authentic. They didn't live in hate and retaliate against society with enough vigor, and they ended up moving on to lead sort of normal lives and so on and so forth. I don't know how true that is. Like, I mean, obviously the black metal musicians of Norway there were numerous crimes attributed to them in the early 90s and so on. So I don't know exactly who he's talking about there, but he seems in some way aggrieved that there were not enough quote unquote true people in the black metal scene in Norway, which seems oddly petty for someone that was so clearly an isolated kind of solitary individual from the very beginning. There's also very pedantic points in there about his childhood, how he was good at soccer, how he liked flying remote control planes. I don't think we needed to know any of this. It's in there anyway. And then obviously he goes on, and there's various statements of an extremely crude kind of misogynistic and racist nature as well, which is you can't really overlook those facts that they are in there. They seem to be part of the man.
I'd love to say that he was an exception, but he was not. But I do love to be reassured that he was very good at flying remote control planes.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, I mean, he did say that he speculated or daydreamed about sort of crashing those planes, I think, and the suffering that would cause, which is, makes it a bit darker, I suppose. It just seems like an innocent anecdote. The way I brought it up before seemed like an innocent anecdote, but I suppose there was a dark side to it.
Crashing a remote control plane, was he going to bonk somebody in the head with it? Like, ah! That's... And meanwhile, Ildjarn standing in the distance just cackling. Like, I got him. But, yeah,
I don't know how to react to that stuff. Like, it doesn't really change my experience of the music. Like, you can kind of tell in the interviews. You don't even have to read the final statement what kind of a person this is. Like, he's not willing to engage in a kind of serious conversation about his art. He sort of rejects everything. His misanthropy is legendary. So I don't really know how far you can take a discussion.
Oh, that's fine. I wholeheartly agree with you and was about to say much the same thing. He, while clearly has a deep intellectual mind, he adamantly refuses to elaborate on it in interviews. Anytime any kind of a deep question is asked of him about the themes of his art, he may sometimes go into detail, sometimes reveal a kind of spark of the imagination behind his music, speaking about the awe-inspiring majesty of nature and what he appreciates about it. But a lot of the times he replies with pretty much, if not almost directly using these words, a firm fuck you. If people ask him something like, what are the deeper philosophical elements to your music? Something that I think has almost been directly asked of him in an interview, he will almost verbatim respond with something like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yes.
And I think it's clear that he actually does, more so than he lets on. But I'm not trying to accuse him of being inauthentic, because if anything, the man's actions are really a testament to his authenticity behind his very deep-seated misanthropy. He has never, throughout all of these years, decided to capitalize on his notoriety or on his relative celebrity within the black metal scene. He remains largely anonymous. He remains largely outside of the spotlight. And he's never bent or capitulated on that matter. So I really do think that there is a lot of sincerity behind his fierce desire to not really give too much of himself to other people.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And just as someone that reviews a lot of newer metal material, I would agree that one thing I hate is being told, well, if you listen to the fourth bar of this stanza, you will understand that I'm trying to express this particular thing about this historical text that I read. It's like, no, okay, just roll it back a second. What's the like overarching theme or whatever? And I have no problem with artists being very, very studied in the source material of what they're inspired by and so on. But you have to, at some point, let the fan base and let the listenership just impose their own interpretation on it. And I think Ildjarn is probably takes it to the extreme, but in that respect, he deserves respect because he takes it to the ultimate level of just the listener is required to do most of the heavy lifting, because Ildjarn is literally playing two chords at you and it's 120 BPM. What are you going to do? And he really does require the listener to engage with the experience fully. But as we've discussed already, there are more elements to that. It's not that he's like dumb or anything. It's not that he's a hack. It's not that he's capitalizing on anything. He did all of this way before those things were really a problem within extreme metal. And he's got us, who I hope you have got the impression by the end of this episode that we're mildly intelligent. We like to think about stuff, at least. He's got us sort of thinking about it, and his work requires you to consider what the fuck he's actually aiming at, and equally his work with Nidhogg as well. It just is another piece in that puzzle as well. So I hope that in listening to this episode, if you got this far, you have gained a greater appreciation for the music of Ildjarn. If you hasn't, I'm about to blast a bunch of it at you right now. But before I do, I would like to thank my co-hosts tonight, who this was a new experiment in that Mike and Tyler have never met each other before, and I'm thrilled that they bonded over Ildjarn because I was really hoping they would, and I knew they would. But yeah, thank you very much, Mike, for joining tonight. I hope to have you back in the very near future.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It would have been super awkward if we both clashed over our love of Ildjarn, so I'm glad that we found some ways to agree.
Oh, yeah.
A great conversation, Tyler. Thanks for making it a fun experience.
If you came to blows, I would find that incredibly awkward, and I'd just be glad that you live on different sides of the Atlantic. But Tyler, my love, thank you for coming back.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really happy that we got to discuss Ildjarn, and honestly, having Mike present was an utter delight. I think the synergy between the three of us was electric. It was fantastic.
I completely agree. And if you two can muster up another weird-ass, obscure 90s extreme black death grind artist that we can talk about, I really want to get you guys on the episode together again. That would be absolutely awesome. And to you, dear listeners, thank you very much for enduring this. I'm going to be playing a piece from Strength and Anger to play you out.